Hello Swen661, my name's Brian Avedikian, and I'll be doing a quick presentation on the PanelGrid functionality of Java Server Faces. We'll start out with a quick general description of PanelGrid and the purpose and why people generally use it. We'll move on to the common attributes that can be defined when using PanelGrid and the general structure. And we'll go over some alternate uses of PanelGrid. And we'll finish off with a PanelGrid example. I'll show some boilerplate example code and then adjust it a little bit in NetBeans so we can see how changing the various attributes affects the look of the table, or of the PanelGrid, excuse me. So the PanelGrid is a class used to display table or tabular data in an HTML element, and the general purpose is to provide a structure with rows and columns that data can be placed into. HTML elements can also be placed into it, giving it an arranged sort of look. Common arguments to create a PanelGrid include specifying the number of columns, the thickness of the border, the cell padding, and cell spacing. And the arguments are presented to PanelGrid in this way, and I'll go into it a little bit here in the next slide. Here's some of these arguments and attributes, and I've pointed over to where they appear visually in the PanelGrid representation. So here we see the columns, which is obvious. In this case, it's set to 3 columns. As you add elements to the PanelGrid, they fill up left to right. So here I've added labels ranging from 1 to 9, and as you add them, you see they fill up in this way. You can specify the border thickness, and that is the width of this black line around all of the cells. The cell padding is the amount of area outside of the cell contents. And the cell spacing is the spacing between these borders here. Some alternate uses for the PanelGrid would be arranging HTML elements other than strings and integers. This would be useful if you wanted to put things like text boxes and buttons into these tables so that they're arranged in a clean-looking, consistent kind of way. Again, these items fill up the rows from left to right and from top to bottom. Tables without the border specified can be used to arrange things on the screen in an organized way without necessarily giving up the fact that you're using a table with rows and columns to organize it. So here's a quick PanelGrid example. Here I call the PanelGrid and specify as arguments the number of columns, the border, the cell padding, and the cell spacing. And then as facets, I have included a header, a footer, and then the various entries as labels to the table. And that gives us this here. So as we can see, we have 3 columns as specified here. We have a border thickness of 1, which is these black lines around here. We have the cell padding, which is the area around this text, has 5. And cell spacing, which is the area between these lines, as 1. So I'm pulling up NetBeans. This is that same code I was just showing you. And we can go ahead and run it. I'll close these from previous runs. And we'll see that we get this same code, or the same output. Increasing the columns to 4, we would expect there to be some missing entries since we only added 9. Now that there are 4 columns, we expect there to be some missing row entries. since they fill up from left to right, top to bottom, and that's what we see right here. Going back to 3 columns, we can increase the border thickness to, say, 5. And here we see the border has increased. Put that back to 1. The cell padding, which is the area around the text, we can increase that to 20 and see that the area around all of the entries of these cells has increased. And then lastly, the cell spacing, the area between those borders, we see that that increases with this attribute. And that's my quick overview of PanelGrid. Thanks for watching.